There is a clearing at the edge of Eldon's timber, maybe 40 yards across, where the grass grows thick and soft in summer, and the spruce trees begin without warning on the far side. We were there last October, Callum and I and his old red heeler Bo, the three of us standing at the head of a low mound we had raked clean of leaves, the way we do every fall. Bo sat about 10 feet from the tree line and watched it with his ears up and his tail low, perfectly calm, the way he always is in that spot. Callum had his cap off. I had mine off too, though the morning was cold enough that my ears ached. We stood there for several minutes without speaking, and the spruce trees were very dark at the near edge, and went on and on behind that. I am 71 years old. I am going to tell you something I have carried for 27 years, that my husband Callum carried for 35 years before that, and that his grandfather carried for more than 30 years before he could bring himself to say it in any words at all. I want to be plain about what I am before I begin, because the account asks something of a listener, and I'm not going to waste your time pretending it does not. I spent 33 years as a timber faller in the BC interior, most of them in the Caribou and the Chilcotin. Some work up in the Nechako country when the contracts went that way. I started at 20, and I did not stop until my knees made it clear the decision was no longer mine. I have felled timber in country where the trees were 7 feet across the butt, and the nearest help was 4 hours away. I know what a bear track looks like, and a cougar track, and a moose track, and I know what a man's track looks like and what a man's sign looks like in the bush. I have spent enough time in deep country that the things which should not be there are not a category I dismiss lightly. I am not a man who invents. I am not a man who embellishes. I did not choose this account, and I would not have looked for it, and I have spent a long time wishing I could set it down, because the weight of a kept secret does not decrease with time. It compounds. The story belongs to Eldon Ramsay, who was Callum's grandfather, and it begins in the Caribou in 1947. I will tell it the way Callum told it to me, which is the way he assembled it from his father's half-told version, and from one long night in 1989 when his father was dying, and gave him the rest in fragments between coughing fits, lying on a narrow bed in a room off the kitchen of the old homestead place, north of Williams Lake. Callum's father said, between one cough and the next, "There are things about your grandfather you need to know." Then he was quiet a long time. Then he said, "Start at the grave. Everything else makes sense from there." Eldon homesteaded north of Williams Lake in 1947, when Crown preemption was still possible in the BC interior if you were willing to go far enough into the back country to find ground no one else had staked. Roughly 40 miles north of town, up a secondary road that in 1947 was a pair of ruts through standing timber, he found a piece of land he could clear enough of to build on, with a creek coming off the hill behind, and a south-facing bench that would hold a kitchen garden. He built the house himself over the first 2 summers, a squared log structure that Callum's father was born in, and that still stood, or mostly stood, when I first saw it in 1997. Eldon was not a rich man. He never was. He ran a few cattle, he trapped in the winters, and he cut timber on contract when the mills were buying. He was a practical, solitary, patient man. The kind of man who builds things to last rather than to impress, and who measures success by whether a thing still works at the end of a season. Margaret came up from Williams Lake in 1949 to marry him. She had known him before, had made up her mind some time before he finished the house, and when she arrived she looked at what he had built and what he had cleared and said, by Callum's account of what his father told him, "This will do fine." She was steady in the way that people who choose a hard life without being pushed into it are sometimes steady. She ran the household, kept a small flock of chickens, helped with the calves in spring, and did not complain about the cold or the distance, or the fact that the nearest neighbor was 12 miles south on the road. She was, as far as anyone who knew them ever said, not surprised by much. The country north of the homestead was unbroken timber for a long distance, spruce and pine, and second-growth fir on the slopes with muskeg between the ridges. Eldon ran his trapline up into that country every winter, out and back on a route he had cut himself over 2 seasons, checking his sets every 4 or 5 days depending on the weather. He knew the country well by 1951. He knew where the moose yarded in deep snow and where the lynx travelled, and where the creek went under the ice and where it did not. That kind of knowledge is not romantic. It is accumulated slowly, by going back to the same country in every season for several years, and paying attention to everything that is not the same as the last time you were there. In late October of 1951, Eldon went up the trapline and found one of his sets disturbed. The set was on a bench above a deadfall, a tangle of old blowdown that had been there long enough for the downed trees to rot in the middle, and for young spruce to come up through the gaps. Eldon had known that deadfall for 4 years. He knew it well enough to walk to it in the dark if he had to. What he found stopped him in a way that nothing in his experience of that country had stopped him before. There was something in the deadfall, something very large, caught partway into a tangle of old root systems that the blowdown had left when the trees went over, the roots making a cage of sorts where the soil had frozen around them. She had come into that deadfall at speed and broken through the surface crust of the frozen ground and gone down into the root tangle to the hip, and the freeze had tightened around her in the night, and she could not pull free. She had been there at least 2 days by the condition of the snow around her. She was upright, leaning into the root mass, and she was looking at him. I have to stop here and say what I can about what Eldon saw, which is what Callum pieced together from his father's account, and from the one time near the end of his life that Eldon spoke of it directly. Eldon described her as very tall. He was a tall man himself, 6 feet and 1 inch, and he estimated that standing free she would have topped him by something close to 1.5 feet. She was covered entirely in dark reddish-brown hair, thick and matted around the arms and legs from the deadfall. Her face was not, by his description, an animal's face. It had proportions he recognized. The eyes were dark and very steady. She was not making any sound when he found her. She had stopped, he thought, because she heard him coming long before he came around the deadfall, and she had gone still. Eldon stood at the edge of the deadfall for what he later described as a long time. He was not a man to run from things, and he was not, by the evidence of what he did next, a man to shoot at things out of simple fear. He looked at her, and she looked at him. He could see from the way she was held in the root tangle that her left leg was the one most deeply caught, and that she had abraded the skin or hide of her forearm badly trying to pull free. He could see she was cold. The temperature that night had gone to something below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and she had been there through at least 2 of those nights. He went back to the homestead. He came back the next morning with a peavey, an axe, and a rope, and he spent the better part of a morning cutting and prying at the frozen root mass until she could pull her leg clear. He did not speak to her during this work except twice, when she shifted and he needed her still, and then he spoke the way you would speak to a large animal you did not want to startle, which is quietly and without sudden movement. She could not walk on the leg he freed. He could see that. He could also see, because the ground around the deadfall was open and the snow was clean, that there was no one coming to help her. He made a decision that Callum's father said he never fully explained even later, in terms of reasoning or justification. He simply did what seemed to him necessary. He built a rough shelter over the near side of the deadfall from material that was already lying there, a lean-to over the driest corner of the root mass, And he went home, and he came back every second day for the rest of that winter with food. I want to be careful here about what I am and am not saying, because this is the part of the account where the rational explanations I have tried over the years fail in sequence. Callum's father had a list of things he had told himself over the years about what his father had really seen, and he recounted them to Callum on that last night, and Callum repeated them to me in 1997, sitting at our kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. The first explanation was a bear, injured and disoriented. Eldon had trapped and hunted bear for years in that country. He knew bear anatomy the way I know the geometry of a falling tree. A bear does not have the proportions he described, and a bear does not go still and watch a man the way he described. The second explanation was another person, a man very large and in rough condition. Callum's father had considered this for a long time. The problem was the hair, which was not clothing, and the hands, which were proportioned wrong for a man, broader across the palm and longer in the fingers than Eldon had words to exactly describe. The third explanation, which Callum's father offered with some embarrassment, was that Eldon had been mistaken, had seen something in poor light and reconstructed it later into what the account required. The problem with this was Eldon's character, which was exact and unsentimental, and the fact that what happened next was not a single morning's encounter, but 2 years of documented, practical, witnessed behaviour on Eldon's part that cannot be explained by a single morning's misidentification. Because Margaret knew. By the end of the first winter, she knew, and she never questioned it. Callum's father told Callum that his mother had said once, just once, when he was old enough to ask her directly, "Your father told me what he found, and I believed him, because your father did not say things that were not true." Margaret accepted it the way she had accepted the distance, and the cold and the work, without dramatics, with practical attention to what was required. She helped pack food when the snow was deep. She dressed the wound on the forearm that had gotten infected through the first winter, going up there twice with Eldon because the infected arm needed more attention than he alone could give it. She had been a practical woman all her life, and she remained one. Through that first winter and into the spring of 1952, the leg healed. By late spring, the creature moved freely on the property, staying mostly in the timber at the north edge, but visible sometimes at the tree line in the early morning. And sometimes, though, this is the part of the account I carry with the most care, closer. Eldon had stopped trying to understand it in any framework he knew. He had simply continued doing what he had been doing, which was going about his work on the homestead and on the trapline and bringing food to the timber edge in the evenings, and the understanding that developed between them over that time was wordless on both sides and practical in its nature, the way understandings between people who work alongside each other sometimes are. She learned, if that is the right word, that the homestead was not a threat. Eldon learned, if that is equally the right word, that the timber at the north edge had been, since before he arrived, already occupied by a presence that had watched him build that house and run that trapline for 4 years before the deadfall. I am offering that as Callum's interpretation of his father's telling, and I want to be honest that I cannot know what Eldon's understanding of it actually was. What I know is the behaviour, which is the most reliable record we have of what a man actually thinks when he cannot find the words. By the second winter, 1952 going into 1953, the arrangement had settled into something that had no name but that functioned. Eldon ran his trapline. The creature stayed in the north timber. Food was left at the edge and taken. Margaret kept chickens and a kitchen garden and did not speak of it to anyone in Williams Lake or on the road, not because she was told not to, but because she understood without being told what kind of account this was and what would happen to it in other hands. Then, in the spring of 1953, she was gone from the Treeline. She did not return through that summer or the following winters. Eldon continued leaving food at the timber edge for 2 more years after she disappeared, by which time Callum's father was old enough to help with the cattle, and had started to notice things about his father's habits that he could not explain. He asked Eldon once why he went to the north edge every evening regardless of the weather. Eldon said, "There may be something that needs it." That was the only explanation he offered for many years. She came back in the spring of 1957, or something of her condition did, which is the only way I know to say this accurately. When she returned to the Treeline that spring, Eldon could see that she had aged in a way that animals do not typically age in 6 years. She moved more slowly. She stayed closer to the established edge and did not range the way she had before. Eldon and Margaret continued the way they had before. The food at the edge, the distance kept, the silence maintained toward the outside world. What passed between them in those years, in that narrow space between the homestead and the timber, I cannot characterize except by its duration, which was years, and by its consistency, which was daily in good weather and as frequent as the winter allowed. She died in the spring of 1963. Eldon found her at the timber edge on a morning in late April, and by the account Callum's father eventually gave, Eldon came back to the house and stood in the kitchen doorway for a long time without speaking, and Margaret looked up from what she was doing at the counter and said, "I'll get the spades." They buried her together in the clearing at the timber edge, that 40-yard opening in the spruce where the grass grows thick and soft in summer, and they made the mound as even and clean as they could. And Margaret said, according to Callum's father, who was 16 and watched from a distance, what sounded from a distance like a few quiet words over the mound, though he could not hear them. Eldon grieved in the way that a man of his temperament and generation grieves, which is by returning to work and by saying very little, and by continuing to tend the grave through every season for the remaining years of his life. The food still went to the timber edge for 2 years after her death, which Callum's father attributed to habit rather than expectation, though he was not certain. The grave was raked clean every fall and left undisturbed every spring to let the grass come back. By 1963, Callum's father was 16 and had understood for several years that there was something at the north edge of the property that his parents kept and did not discuss, and that he was not to ask about in detail. He asked once, when he was about 12, what the mound was, and Margaret told him it was an animal that had been important to them and that they kept it properly because that was the right thing to do. She said, "When your father is ready, he'll tell you more." Eldon was never quite ready, or ready only at the very end, and the end did not allow for much. Eldon died in 1981, and his last years had not given him many clear days, and the full account went with him in large part. What Callum's father had was the outline: the deadfall in the winter of 1951, the 2 years of tending, the long relationship, the death and burial in 1963. What he did not have, because Eldon had never been able to say it plainly, was what the relationship had actually been. The wordless nature of it was not Eldon's failure to explain. It was the nature of the thing itself. There was no language already built for what it was, and Eldon was not a man who built new language for things he had lived. Callum's father tended the grave from 1963 onward, first alongside his parents, then alongside his own wife after Eldon was gone, then alone in his later years. In 1989, he was dying of the lung condition that timber country produced in men of that generation, and Callum came to sit with him through the last weeks. On one of those nights when the house was quiet except for the wood stove ticking and the sound of his father's breathing, Callum's father told him what he could. It came in pieces, and it was not complete. And between some of the pieces there were long enough silences that Callum was not sure his father had the strength to continue. "The grave at the north edge," his father said at one point, just that. Then later, "You keep it the way we kept it, clean in the fall, undisturbed in the spring." Then, near the end of the night, "Your grandfather was a good man. What he did there with her, it was the most decent thing I ever saw a man do for something that had nobody else." Callum sat with that for a long time. He said he did not ask questions because his father was using everything he had just to say what he said, and questions would have cost more than was there to spend. He said the last thing his father told him, in what turned out to be the last coherent night, was, "Don't let anyone dig it up. I have told you that I am not a man given to the inexplicable." I want to say that again here because I think it is important that you understand what I brought to this account when Callum told it to me in 1997, which was skepticism, a working man's resistance to the categories it required, and a genuine effort to find the seam in it, the place where the account departed from what was plausible, where the transmitted story had been improved, or simplified, or warped by the decades of passing. I looked for that seam for a long time. I could not find it. The details are too specific and too consistent across the two tellings, Callum's father to Callum and Callum to me, to be the product of gradual embellishment. The practical texture of it is wrong for invention. A man who invents a story like this gives the creature speech or a rescue or a moment of drama. Eldon's story has none of that. It is a story about a man finding something injured and doing the practical thing, and then continuing to do the practical thing for 12 years, because that is the kind of man he was. And the creature in it is never given language or motive that exceed what the behavior directly showed. Eldon's grief in 1963 is not described as overwhelming. It is described as a man standing in a doorway for a long time. That is the grief of a man who has lost something he had no name for and who is not going to perform it for anyone. That detail did not come from invention. It came from observation. I married Callum in 1997, and when he told me the story that year, it was not as a thing to be believed or disbelieved, but as an obligation to be shared, because the obligation required two people to carry properly, and he had been carrying it alone since 1989. He took me to the grave that first October. We walked up through the cattle pasture and through the gap in the fence at the north edge and across the clearing to the mound, and I stood there the same way I stand there now every fall, with my cap off and the cold coming off the spruce trees on the far side. He told me what to do. Rake the leaves in the fall, do not disturb the mound in spring, do not direct anyone to the location, do not mark it on any document or map. I asked him once, some years in, whether he believed it. He was quiet for a while, then he said, "I believe my father, and I believe my grandfather, and the grave is there." He turned his cap in his hands. Whatever she was buried by people who loved her. That's enough for me. I am going to tell you about Bo, because Bo belongs to this account. He is Callum's dog, an old red heeler with one torn ear from a bull that caught him wrong 3 years back, and he goes with us to the clearing every fall because Callum takes him everywhere. Bo is not a nervous animal. He has worked cattle for 10 years and he does not spook easily. But at the clearing at the north edge, he does something I have watched every fall for years and have never seen him do anywhere else. He sits about 10 feet from the tree line and he watches the trees with his ears up and his tail low, and he does not bark and he does not press forward. He simply attends. Callum noticed it before I did and said nothing about it for the first 2 or 3 years. And then one fall he said, while we were standing at the mound, "Bo does that every time." I said I had noticed. He said, "I don't think there is anything in those trees." He paused. I think he can tell there was, though. I did not have a response to that, and I still do not. So I'm leaving it the way he said it. The grave is 61 years old this spring. The mound has settled a great deal over those years, as mounds do, and the grass over it now is the same grass as the rest of the clearing. You would not distinguish it except that we know where it is, and Bo knows where it is. The spruce on the far side are taller than they were in 1963, grown up through what was already old timber then, and the clearing is still 40 yards across, and the grass still grows thick in summer. I am telling this now because Callum and I are not young men, and there will come a time, not so far off, when we will not be able to make the walk in October, and after that there will be a time when there is no one left who knows why that mound is there, or what is in it, or what it cost the people who put it there. I have thought about that for several years. I asked Callum whether he thought we ought to tell it before we were gone, and he was quiet a long time, which with Callum usually means he has already thought about it and is deciding how much of what he thought to say. Then he said, "Eldon kept it because he didn't trust people with it. I've kept it because I made a promise. But the promise was about the grave, not about the story." He looked out of the kitchen window toward the north field. "The story should go somewhere. So that is where we are. Callum knows I am telling this, and he has said what he said, and I'm going to say the rest as plainly as I know how to. What Eldon Ramsay found in that deadfall in the autumn of 1951 was a creature he had no category for, and he chose not to build a category for it. He chose to do the practical thing, which was to free it, and to keep doing the practical thing, which was to tend it through 2 winters, when it could not tend itself, and to continue after that in the way that a long acquaintance continues, with regularity and with the kind of low-key faithfulness that does not require a name for what it is. He buried her with care and with grief, and with the same hands that had built his house and run his trapline and worked that country for 30 years. And then he tended her grave for the rest of his life, and then his son tended it, and now his grandson does. I have looked for the word for what Eldon was to her and what she was to Eldon. The account uses the word the family settled on over time, which I will not repeat here because it is a word with edges on it that do not quite fit, that suggest more than the account supports and less than the behaviour over 12 years suggests. What I know is what the behaviour showed, which is that he went to that clearing every fall through 30 years of his life to rake the leaves off a mound, and that Margaret stood beside him every time until she was too old to walk that far, and that when Callum's father watched the 2 of them bury her in 1963, he said the thing he remembered most clearly was not what they said over the mound, but the fact that his father's shoulders shook once, briefly, and then went still, and his father did not speak for the rest of that day. I am not asking you to name what it was. I don't know what it was. Callum does not know. Eldon did not know, or if he did not leave the word behind. I am asking you only to understand that the account is real, and the grave is real, and the 61 years of tending it are real, and that somewhere in the Caribou, 40 miles north of Williams Lake, in a clearing at the edge of a stand of spruce that goes on for a very long distance, there is a mound that has been kept clean every fall and left undisturbed every spring since 1963 by people who understood that the creature in it had, at one point, nobody. Eldon gave her somebody. That is the thing I want you to carry away from this. Not the impossibility of what he found, though that is real, and not the difficulty of what he kept for 30 years, though that is real too. The thing is simpler than either of those. He found something alone and hurt and far from anything that recognized it. And he came back the next morning with tools, and he kept coming back. And then he kept the grave for the rest of his life, because that is what you do. There is a kind of man who encounters something the world has no room for and immediately makes room. Eldon Ramsay was that kind of man. Margaret was that kind of woman. Their son became that kind of man, quietly, on a dying man's last coherent night. And Callum, my husband, who has walked to that clearing every October since he was a young man and stood there with his cap off, is that kind of man too. I have carried this account for 27 years. I have told it twice. Once to a man I trust more than anyone living, and once to you. I don't know whether Bo can tell there was something in those trees, the way Callum said. I think about that sometimes in the evenings when the dark comes early and the timber at the north edge goes black before anything else does. I think that if you spent enough time in deep country, paying real attention, you would begin to understand that the country keeps records of its own in ways that do not require writing, and that what is attended to carefully enough for long enough leaves a mark that the attending itself cannot fully account for. The grave is there. Callum will go in the fall, and I will go with him while I can, and we will stand at the head of the mound with our caps off, and Bo will sit near the tree line with his ears up, watching the dark between the spruce trees in that calm and certain way of his. And the grass over the mound will be the same as the rest of the clearing, and the morning will be cold, and we will say nothing, because there is nothing left to say that the years of going back have not already said better. If there is something in this that sounds like something you have been told, or something you have seen in your own time in the back country, there is another account on screen now from someone else who found the official version of the world too small to hold what they know. It will be worth your time.